The army doesn't like more than one disaster in a day.
Looks bad in the newspapers and upset civilians at their breakfast.
I'm Bill Bupert. Welcome to War Notes, a conflict podcast in which we will be taking a journey into history, discussing contemporary events, and even doing some conflict futurism. This clash and collision between complex adaptive systems armed to the teeth to see who will prevail and see what it tells us about the human condition and why we can't stop. Hello, this is Bill, and welcome to War Notes, episode 20, entitled The Jerboa That Squeaked, Broke and Woke NATO on the Warpath. So today we're going to discuss some things that I think are quite interesting when it comes to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Those of you who are persistent and perennial listeners, thank you for being that, know that I have a very dim view of NATO, and also know that I am very hypercritical of what they do for a living. Not only have I read the books and conducted the research and actually been stationed when I was in uniform in Germany proper, which was a wonderful time to be alive in the military. Really enjoyed that at the turn of this millennium. As a matter of fact, it was when I was stationed in Heidelberg, Germany, during the events of 9/11, and I was able to be on the ground and see the reactions there from afar, and it was quite interesting. Then I also spent 2 years in Afghanistan, working in both Kabul and then in Mazar-e Sharif in the north, near the Uzbeki border. And I was elbow to elbow with our NATO allies, more so in Kabul than the north, but I was on a German-Dutch base, so I was exposed to how NATO conducts itself on a regular basis. Let's just say that I was rather underwhelmed with their warrior performance, their logistical performance, and everything in theater, and that even though there were literally dozens of general officers, many of whom hailed from the European nations that are members of NATO on the ground in Kabul in the Green Zone, I rarely ran across any with whom I was impressed. The exception to that would probably be the Australians. The Australians have a very interesting niche that they've developed where they have become, through some martial magic of their own, very astute and capable planners. So of all the allies that I was ever exposed to, they're the ones who are gifted, I think, to a large extent in extrapolative effects, how branches and sequels work, which is military argot and parlance for, well, what are we going to do with this current war plan before us, left of bang, right of bang once this happens, and things don't turn out the way we thought that they would. Well, what's going to happen after that? They were rather astute. I never ran into that extrapolative capability nor that critical thinking capability with my very limited exposure. Remember, this is anecdotal from my perspective of being on staff in Europe, and also articles that I've read, videos that I've seen, books that I've read, those kind of things. I am left underwhelmed with the martial prowess of all of our NATO allies. By the way, you may ask, Bill, what in the hell is a jerboa? A jerboa is the smallest rodent in the world, generally considered the Baluchistan pygmy jerboa. Latinate name is Salpigatulis michaelis, a tiny creature native to Pakistan, about 2 inches long, with a long tail, known for its kangaroo-like hops and large eyes, though sometimes tied with African pygmy mouse for the title. These adults average 1.7 inches. Why in the world would I compare NATO to a jerboa, to this smallest rodent in the world? And the reason I did that is because I think that their capabilities are suspect. They lack martial imagination, and they've certainly gotten so incredibly lazy since the end of World War II in April 1945 in the European theater of operations, and then the institutionalization of NATO, where because America was the biggest bully on the block militarily, they sort of took advantage from an economic standpoint of having their little hamster aquarium on the continent not have to worry about shouldering the wheel as far as expenses, technological innovation in aircraft, ships, land modalities, whatever the case may be, to the extent where they got, frankly, lazy. And over decades, including the massive expansion east of NATO that I have called the ball on and complained about in detail in other episodes in both Chasing Ghost and War Notes. And I'm always underwhelmed by everything that they do, with the exception of some of the special operations forces. I give kudos and credit to the light infantry organizations and special operations organizations. One can look at the British Army, and you find that the British Special Air Service and the British Special Boat Service, sort of a SEAL analog for them, out of the Royal Navy, I believe, are very capable organizations, but they're very tiny organizations. I think that the paratroopers that they have, of which they only have a regiment minus, numbers less than 5,000. Their Royal Marines are also creditable. The French have some very interesting and capable forces, although the French historically, since the 1990s, when it came to expeditionary warfare, have been incapable of deploying anything and logistically satisfying what that battalion needed, which is 600 to 1,000 men, a battalion task force, and that's across the ocean, or the bathtub of the Mediterranean, as it were, in the former metropolitan France holdings in Algeria and surrounding countries, former Francophone countries to include Algeria, of course, Tunisia, and even hearkening back to the Chad-Libya wrestling matches in the 1980s and the 1990s. And then one, of course, can go back to the early 19th century, and you see the formation of the French Foreign Legion. And while it is a shadow of its former self, most of the French Foreign Legion's active forces just so happen to be at the European Space Agency launch facilities near the equator, in Latin America as we speak, in French Guiana. It also happens to be the case that when it comes to strategic airlift and strategic sea lift, and mind you, let me take you to school for just a minute, and that's this. At the tactical level, that is the pointy end of the spear, the bloody point of the spear. At the operational level, that is that junction between tactics and strategy, where you're actually operationalizing and playing the chess pieces that are armies, navies, and air forces, and finding out what you're going to do to achieve intermediate goals, strategy and grand strategy being much more political than strategy, but strategy also having the importance of imposing said grand strategic political goals in the end. It just so happens that at the tactical and operational level, even the Germans, the once vaunted German armed forces, are just severely lacking in capability to do what they're supposed to do. Now, there is an adage that was championed by Tom Clancy, and Tom Clancy didn't invent this. I think that he just lifted it from somebody else, in which the adage reads, amateurs are concerned with tactics and professionals are concerned with logistics. And mind you, and I want to give a hat tip to my colleague Douglas Nussbaum out at the Navy Postgraduate School, war winners are concerned with energy and energy transfer and production. Because in the end, you can take those first two things that I just mentioned per Clancy, but if you don't have energy and the ability to either export it, build it, and provision it in the long term consistently, you can't win a war, especially in expeditionary conflict. Let me say first and foremost, I have been fundamentally opposed to U.S. membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization since 1992. I think that it saw its way in fighting the Warsaw Pact forces of the old Soviet Union between 89 and 91. Said Soviet Union dissolves, and all of a sudden, in my mind, a year later, the use of NATO dissolves. As a matter of fact, during the first Bolsheviks administration, there was talk of retiring NATO and getting rid of it. Of course, the Europeans, for more cynical and Machiavellian reasons, lobbied the United States to not even consider that, because if that were considered, then they would lose this gravy train that they've been on, where they can pursue, especially when one fast forwards to today, all of their massive welfare states, their massive illegal immigration frameworks, and their massive wokeification of their respective societies from sea to shining lake in Europe proper, east to west, north to south. Now, I am hopeful that there are some former Eastern European Soviet bloc nations that are looking at the EUSSR that has been forming out of Brussels for the past 15 years and saying, been there, done that, got the t-shirt, got the gulag, don't want any part of that anymore. So that's why you see resistance from countries like Poland and Hungary to this massive and idiotic wokeification of the European Union and, by extension, NATO. Why is NATO in the news? Because Trump, the current administration, as is their wont, has been doing some 3D chess, 4D chess, saber rattling, or just speaking in a most ill-informed manner, however you want to perceive it, of actually taking Greenland. Well, it turns out that Greenland apparently belongs to Denmark, and Denmark just so happens to be one of the NATO midgets. Greenland is in autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark, not a possession in the colonial sense. It became part of this Danish realm in 1953, gained home rule in 1979, and achieved extensive self-government, including self-determination, in 2009. Though Denmark retains control over foreign and defense policy, Greenlanders are Danish citizens and hold the right to self-determination, meaning any path to full independence would involve Greenlandic consent through a referendum. So, mind you, when it comes to a government, in this case, Denmark claims possession, but it is not in the colonial sense. And even Denmark themselves, especially as a result of the 2009 Self-Government Act, allows Greenland to take over most domestic responsibilities, but the other things belong to the Nordic Council and Denmark itself. Now, this relationship between Greenland and Denmark has not always been a bowl of cherries or a bed of roses for both of them. Based on recent investigations and reports from 2023 through 25, Denmark carried out a coercive campaign of birth control known as the, and please excuse my inability to pronounce it properly in Danish, spiral campaign on Greenlandic Inuit women between the late 1960s and the early 1990s. This is a 30-year span aiming to limit population growth in Greenland. There were the key aspects of that campaign were forced IUD insertion. More than 4,000 Inuit women and girls, some as young as 12, were fitted with these intrauterine devices or coils without their consent or knowledge. Many girls were fitted with these devices while visiting school clinics. An inquiry confirmed that many women later faced complications, lifelong trauma, or infertility due to the devices. The campaign reduced the birth rate in Greenland by roughly 50% during that 30-year period. Now, how do we know about this? Because of the spiral investigation. In 2022, Denmark and Greenland agreed to a 2-year investigation into the campaign. In 2025, there followed on an apology and compensation. In September 2025, Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen visited Nuuk and offered a formal apology for the injustices, announcing a reconciliation fund to compensate the victims. Legal actions, hundreds of women have pursued legal action, with reports indicating over 350 women and girls were affected, many as young teenagers. Now, keep in mind that The present population in Greenland is roughly 55,000. And of course, this campaign, another permutation on a eugenics and paternalism pursuit that seems to be part of 20th century Denmark. From 1929 to 1967, Denmark involuntarily sterilized approximately 11,000, quote, abnormal, end of quote, individuals, including the mentally disabled, alcoholics, and promiscuous women. While this program was primarily centered in Denmark, its underlying ideology influenced the treatment of Inuit people as subnormal subjects. There was forced child removal. These were social experiments where the Inuit children were forcibly removed from their families to be raised in Danish foster homes. This even got United Nations scrutiny. In 2023, UN experts called on Denmark to address the structural and systematic racial discrimination stemming from its colonial legacy in Greenland. You know, when you're censured by the United Nations, of all places, for your bad behavior, things are pretty awful. So that's a slight overview that shows you that the Danes haven't always been the penultimate or wonderful global citizens that they make themselves out to be in EU propaganda. So let's discuss the Danish armed forces. In Danish, that would be the Forsvaret, are the united military of the Kingdom of Denmark, responsible for defending Denmark proper, as well as its self-governing territories of Greenland and the Faroe Islands. They also contribute to Denmark's societal resilience during times of national crisis and disasters. Keep in mind, this is the same country that in the German invasion of Denmark in 1940, a swift occupation known as the 6-Hour War due to Denmark's quick surrender to avoid destruction. That 1940 invasion, part of Operation Weserübung, a secured German access to Sweden's iron ore and strategic control, leading to a 5-year occupation marked by Danish resistance and sabotage until liberation in 1945. The structures and branches, there's the Royal Danish Army, which is known as the Hæren. There's the Royal Danish Navy, which is known as the Sovereignnet. There's the Royal Danish Air Force, the Flyvevåbnet, and the Home Guard, which is the Hjemmeværnet. Now, the Royal Danish Navy, they operate a fleet of around 20 commissioned ships, twice as many as New Zealand. The primary land force in the Army focused on mechanized and infantry capabilities. They're also NATO contributors to various operations over the decades. The Danish Air Force operates fixed-wing fighters. They're transitioning, poor them, to the F-35 Alpha Lightning II. Notice it is not the F-35 Bravo Charlie, or they'd be even worse off. Transport aircraft, although it is a tiny transport fleet of about a dozen aircraft with the C-130 Juliets. Helicopters to include MH-60 Romeo Seahawks, which are used for search and rescue primarily, and other assets. Large reserve and militia. Now, what do their personnel look like? Here's what it looks like. Active duty is around 20,000 professional forces across branches. This is all of it. These are estimates from 2025 and 26. Reserves and Home Guard, 45 to 60,000. The Army typically fields 7,000 to 9,000 professional troops, and that is across the board. Denmark does have conscription, has a lottery system for women in 2025. God's help them. Basic service is 4 months, enough time to not know what you're doing, maybe even to learn some bad habits and then bring them further if you're ever called up. Now, mind you, in 25 and 26, spending exceeds 3% of GDP, which is well above a 50% increase of the NATO 2% target for all countries across the board. It's driven by an acceleration fund, which provides approximately $7 billion US dollars for rapid investments. This includes replacing equipment donated to the Ukraine, acquiring new systems such as that F-35, such as their vaunted CV-90 infantry fighting vehicles, artillery like the Pulse and the Atmos and others, drone integration, things like that. By the way, you'll chuckle because recently, if you're keeping up with the news, and this is being issued on 19 January 2026, there was a headline that read, European soldiers arrived in Greenland, but on a rented airliner. Now, the reason for this is because Denmark intentionally banned military aircraft from other nations from landing on Greenland to prevent escalation with the United States. The original plan was from Germany to fly to Greenland using A400 Mike Atlas transports. Germany has about 50 of those. As you know, with the law that I like to follow when it comes to the distribution of military assets, especially exquisite platforms, there's a one-third rule, which means that one-third are capable immediately in the next 24 hours to be employed, and the remaining two-thirds are in training, upkeep, revitalization, reconstitution, recovery, repair, whatever the case may be. So if Germany has 50 A400 Mike military transport aircraft, we can call the ball and say that they have approximately 16 to 17 available to deploy troops. And let's expand our scope here a little bit more, and you'll see why when I tie this all with a bow before we talk about existing agreements in Greenland proper, and why the future is going to be very interesting when it comes to this. As I've said, I am opposed to U.S. membership in NATO for a variety of reasons that I have bored my persistent listeners with in previous podcast episodes. Recently, Carney, who was the successor to Fidel Castro's bastard son, Justin Trudeau, in Canada, has promised that he is going to realign himself with China instead of the United States and the Western Hemisphere because of Trump, because of this administration. So here we have the Canadians, who just so happen to share a rather large border with the United States. Carney, who is a WEF creature and a former banker and economist. I'm an economist by training, and when I look at him, I think, economics did you study? Because it makes no sense to me whatsoever. Canada, which is part of Five Eyes. Five Eyes would be the US, the UK, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, are privy to intelligence collaborations, military agreements, and things like that. That gives them probably, I would say, a point of privilege above even that of NATO as a result of that. But here we have a member of Five Eyes, which I just delineated, going to China and trying to not only strengthen relations with them, but increase commerce relations, maybe military agreements and those kind of things. This is the very same Mark Carney who last year in 2025 cited, and I'm paraphrasing, China is the number one threat to Canada. Now, there's a lot of things that we don't have to handle in this particular episode as far as Chinese incursions in Canada, intelligence incursions, espionage, those kind of things. And the natural leftward tilt of Canadian politics means that they are much more susceptible to that than other countries. Like Israel, where you have a left-wing party, which is the Likud, and a left-of-left party, which is Labour, the same thing happens in Canada. For the most part, with single percentage delineations, all parties in Canada tend to be very socialist and government supremacist in their orientation, and they wouldn't have it any other way. Now, I bring that up because Canada, also being a member of NATO, not only being a member of Five Eyes, also being a member of AUKUS, which is the Australian, UK, and Australian alliance, at least at the periphery. I'm doing this to set the stage because when one looks at a map, and I would urge you, if you have the opportunity, I don't want you to drive off the road if you're listening to this podcast, but you will find that looking at a map of Greenland, especially if you look at it from the North Pole, as if, picture this, you're looking down, you're looking directly at the North Pole, and then all of a sudden you are scoping out as if you are a human satellite, and you see that in the periphery around the Arctic, that 55 to 58% of that total periphery just so happens to be owned by the Russians, with permanent habitation and military presence and the ability to operate in Arctic conditions much better than any other country on Earth, to include the largest icebreaker fleet on Earth, of which the U.S. possesses 1.5 icebreakers. You see why there is an interest on the part of the United States in either purchasing Greenland, bringing them over under provisos, or having a much closer relationship with them than we had otherwise. Now, again, deep background is necessary because I would tell you that on my examination of the Greenland SOFA agreements, the status of forces agreements, when you look at them in the general NATO status of forces agreements that apply to all U.S. military personnel in Europe and in Greenland, and these are supplemented by specific provisions, and we're going to go through some of those. It's the end of World War II. 6 years later, in 1951, there is a Defense of Greenland Agreement, this core bilateral treaty between the U.S. and Denmark, acting on behalf of Greenland at the time, which was then a colony. Isn't that funny that they say it was a colony, even though Denmark insists that it isn't, established the framework for the defense of Greenland and the broader North Atlantic area within NATO. It granted the U.S. broad rights to establish and operate military bases and facilities, house personnel, and exercise military jurisdiction within designated defense areas, which just so happened from the northern tip of Greenland to the southern tip of Greenland to mostly be situated on the western coast of said country. The NATO Status of Forces Agreement since 1955, that SOFA has applied to Greenland. The SOFAs are multilateral or bilateral agreements that define the legal status of foreign military personnel operating in a host country. Key provisions often address criminal jurisdiction, taxation, and the right to import-export goods duty-free. Fast forward to the 2004 Igaliku Agreement. This agreement updated the 1951 Pact to reflect Greenland's enhanced self-governance as a result of Denmark ceding to them self-determination that they had been seeking for the longest time, especially in light of the eugenics program that I described to you earlier, making the government of Greenland a formal party to the agreement. So it became a tripartite agreement, even though one can say it goes beyond that because it's under NATO imprimatur also. It clarified that certain articles of the 1951 Defense Agreement are superseded by or supplementary to the NATO SOFA. It also mandates that the U.S. consult with and inform both the Danish and Greenlandic governments before implementing any significant changes to military operations or facilities. And what you also discover is that NATO has no veto power over this tripartite agreement from 2004. So here's some of the key provisions that you have to keep in mind. The jurisdiction, its U.S. military personnel are primarily subject to the NATO SOFA's rules on criminal jurisdiction. Movement, U.S. forces have the right to move freely between defense areas, currently focused on Pitufnik Space Base by Land, Air, and Sea. That is located near the northern part on the western coast. Personnel status would be U.S. military and civilian personnel involved in base activities are generally exempt from Danish and Greenlandic taxes and duties, which means that it is U.S. soil essentially. Cooperation. The 2004 agreement improved local cooperation by allowing the Greenlandic government to have a representative consult with the U.S. commanding officer on local matters. That consultation also recognizes Danish sovereignty. The U.S. must consult with the Danish and Greenlandic governments before making significant operational changes. But here's something that you will find very interesting. When you look at the fine print in these agreements, you see that not only does NATO not have veto power over what the U.S. does in Greenland, nor does Denmark. I think that the Danish would love to have a conversation or maybe a Department of State meeting where they alter that so that they do have veto power over what the United States does in Greenland. Those of you who are interested in further reading on this, you can actually read that agreement, and I will put it in the show notes. It is in the Treaties and Other International Acts Series 04-806, agreement between the United States of America and Denmark, dated August 6th, 2004. I would urge you to read it. It's an interesting document, and what it basically reads is that not much changed from 1951. What that means is that between 1951 and 2004, while there was a wholesale abandonment of so many bases that were formerly U.S. Cold War bases, like Thule Air Base and others primarily on the western coast of Greenland, it doesn't mean, according to this treaty when you read it, that those couldn't be reactivated as the United States wishes. This is a sticking point that the mainstream media is not paying too much attention to. And now what the major kerfuffle seems to be, especially if one takes a look at that map like I told you about. When one looks at the map, maybe you'll have one in front of you now, you see that Greenland just so happens to be much closer to America than it does to Denmark. If one were to go to the northern reaches of Maine, you would find that it is closer to Maine than it is to Denmark proper. It is a massive country. Again, when one looks at the map, it happens to be the largest island, as it were, in an archipelago when you go to the west and look at the far Canadian reaches of the Canadian northern provinces. And of course, yes, Greenland is closer to Canada than it is to Maine, but Denmark, again, remains much farther away than Conus is to Greenland proper. And why is that a concern for the Danish? It's because, as I've just mentioned, the Danish armed forces are tiny. When one looks at the aggregate of NATO forces, less the U.S. and less the Polish forces, what you discover is that it is the mouse that roared. They have very little in the way of armies. If one looks at the United Kingdom and you take a look at the British Army, you find that it is at one of its lowest ebbs ever, with nearly 75,000 troops in the end strength, of which approximately 10%, because of that fabled tooth-to-tail ratio, which is how many trigger pullers are supported by logistics on the back in combat support and combat service support. If you took the paras, if you took the Royal Marines, and you took the British Army itself, a little bit north of 10,000 trigger pullers might exist in the British Army at all. But do the British have the airlift? Do they have the sea lift? I just mentioned the British Army is at one of its lowest ebbs in manpower. The same thing applies to the Royal Navy, where they couldn't possibly mount, despite how enfeebled that effort was in 1981 and 1982 with the Falklands. They could not possibly replicate what the British Navy, the Royal Navy, did in the early 1980s when they took the Falklands, known to the Argentines as the Malvinas, away from the Argentine troops who had landed there to take possession of that British possession. So the Danes are in a bad way, numerically, again, maybe very much like the Jerboa that I mentioned in the title here. The United Kingdom and France and Germany happen to be the big three. I'm accepting Poland here because I get the impression that Poland is really not interested in getting in this kerfuffle. But I do forecast that in the future, by 2050, Poland will probably be numerically and maybe even competence-wise the leading armed force on the continent. But we'll see what transpires over the next few decades. But when you look at France and you look at the UK and you look at Germany, maybe they do have the troops. Maybe they can even bring in conscripts. Maybe they can even activate their reserves. Maybe they can even do the kind of things that they claim they can on land, whether it's with infantry fighting vehicles or tanks or light infantry, whatever the case may be. They don't have the sea lift. They don't have the strategic airlift. Again, using the rule of threes, I told you that there are 50 A400s available. There are not that many C-130 Juliets available for transport aircraft for the Danes. Same thing applies for the British, who have under 50 transport aircraft in their entire Royal Air Force. So I think that all of this saber rattling that is going on here, one has to ask fundamental questions, and that's this. Is NATO less the U.S. forces capable of expeditionary projection of forces that would number beyond that of a brigade combat team, which is approximately 2,000 troops on the ground, much less division strength formations that would go into Greenland to fight the United States. Now, if you're a long listener of my podcast, you know that I am quite acidic and corrosive in thinking that America's armed forces are capable of conducting peer combat in this century. And I still find them wanting. But if I find them wanting, I find the NATO forces, less the United States, even more wanting. As a matter of fact, and I think that this will fly in the face of the conventional wisdom that you're probably being fed by the coprophile media as we speak, that as a continental force, even with its disparate parts and pieces with the respective nation states and their armed forces, some of them may have their own peculiar capabilities that make them a step above the remainder of their colleagues and confrères on the continent. Like when I look at the SAS and the SBS in Great Britain, I think that they probably field some of the finest special operations forces on the European continent. The GIGN and some of the French commando forces aren't bad at all. All of these respective countries in Europe have their own forces and such that specialize in ways that are better than their confrères. But taken as a whole, again, less the United States, they not only don't have the airlift or sea lift, but let's suppose we will suspend our disbelief that they do. What would they lift? What are these vaunted military forces, these trigger pullers that would be the combat power that they could put on the ground? And in this case, curiously enough, accepting certain other Article 5 invocations, whether it was Greeks fighting Turks, both NATO members, or the attack on 9/11, where Article 5 was invoked so that NATO became part of the fight against those who committed those acts on September 11th, 2001. Now, starting a year ago with the new administration coming in and starting to ask, as the Trump administration had done from 2016, 2017, until 2020, for NATO to pay its fair share, to put its shoulder to the martial and, in this case, fiduciary wheel to pay their fair share in their expense. Hence what I had mentioned earlier about a 2% target for GDP of military spending for these respective nations, and very few of them have stood up and actually done it. I just mentioned, by the way, that the Danes are not only at 3%, but they are above 2% by 1 percentage point, and they are above and beyond one of the better forces on the ground, one of the better militaries in NATO that has really decided to step up and contribute. I find it really curious with all of this, where the saber rattling concerning Greenland, NATO is willing to probably fracture, if not destroy, the NATO relationship that's been had essentially since the end of World War II, codified in the 1950s, over what is an emotional tantrum on the part of the EU, SSR, and NATO, because they don't like who happens to be in the Oval Office in Washington, D.C. at this time. I find that a bit childlike, especially in view since 2022. There has been a war in the Ukraine that was ostensibly started by Russia kinetically, but one can also find the DNA and forensic evidence of the provocations since 2004, but I've handled that in other episodes as far as who's to blame for what happened in Ukraine. But NATO has emptied the cupboards. They have emptied their ammunition supply points. They have emptied their larders, their martial larders, as it were, to give to the Ukrainians everything they could possibly do. And here we find ourselves in a position where, as I had forecasted 1 month after the Russian incursion into the Ukraine, that the Ukraine would not only not be able to win, but they wouldn't even be able to achieve a stalemate or a frozen peace unless Russia dictated the terms. And here we are now. So NATO for the past 18 months, well, one can say back to 2022, has been saying that the Russian bugbear is prepared to invade Europe. Well, I'm here to tell you that the Russians are having a hard enough time securing the eastern third of the Ukraine. They have no prayer whatsoever of conventionally taking on NATO and Europe, as pathetic and awful as all of their armed forces are without exception, especially when it comes to numerical standards. The Russians could, though, through the use of missiles, even their hypervelocity Wunderweapons like the Ureshnik, they could take these and take out very significant portions of C4I in NATO and the EU. C4I would be command and control, computers and communications, where they could take out energy networks and such. And we've seen that ever since 2022, that we look at Germany, for instance, and all of a sudden, Germany is looking at the Morgenthau plan that was rejected by both Eisenhower, FDR, and, well, the third person would be President Truman, where because of World War I and World War II and the blame on the Germans for starting these respective wars, Hans Morgenthau out of the Treasury wanted the Morgenthau plan where Germany would be deindustrialized and it would become a pastoral economy of poets and cobblers and farmers and such. Well, it turns out that if we fast forward today, much like the United Kingdom's adoption of Operation Sea Lion 2.0, Operation Sea Lion, of course, was the German invasion of Great Britain in 1940 and 41 that never occurred, but Starmer and his colleagues decided to impose it themselves. Like that, there's almost a volunteer act, a surrendering, or even an adoption of a modified 21st century Morgenthau plan to deindustrialize Germany with the destruction not only of their nuclear plants, not only of the Nord Stream, whoever may be responsible for that, wink, wink, but Russian natural gas is what drove the German industrial giant in Europe proper for the past few generations. No one builds like the Germans, no one industrializes like the Germans. So now that we're seeing maybe the nadir, maybe even the total destruction of the German economy, because now, as a result of green policies and others, they have the highest energy prices in Europe, and they are losing major and storied industries by the dozen every year as a result of these very blinkered and short-term green energy provisions that have laid the Germans low. Now, I'm saying this because all of a sudden in the last 60 days, we have seen a pivot, and that pivot is this: Russia, Russia, Russia. NATO used that as a stalking horse, not only to urge its member nations to increase the respective portions of their GDPs that would be devoted to defense, but now we're hearing noises about the Europeans, I call it the EUSSR, because I do think that it may become the greatest threat to world peace, liberty, and prosperity on Earth next to the BRICS nations, maybe even overwhelming the BRICS nations as the major threat on the planet when it comes to that kind of thing. It's my podcast. I can have my own opinions. And now, with a click of the red ruby slippers in Brussels, they pivot to the west. And from the east being the Russians, and all of a sudden, the Russians as an existential geopolitical threat to the continent proper, it dissolves. They click their fingers, face the United States, Orange Man bad, don't like the policies, especially those policies concerning immigration, and it has become a flashpoint, a flash fire, maybe even a massive existential forest fire, where because of notions of taking Greenland, invading Greenland, buying Greenland, all of a sudden it has fixed the gaze of NATO and Brussels on the United States as the next existential threat, where we even see NATO members saying that if America militarily invades Greenland, which I doubt will happen, but I'll stand corrected if it does, that all the NATO forces will invoke Article 5, isn't that curious, to defend the Danes in defending their possession. Remember, it's not colonial. It was before, but it's not now, from U.S. occupation. A proviso: I am no way recommending that America militarily invade Greenland. I think that invasions don't always end well. The jury is out on Venezuela. As you know, I did in episode 070, where I talked about the Bolivarian tar pit down there in Venezuela. I can't say that I would condone what happened with the removal of Maduro. Now, I have a paid subscriber occasional podcast series that I do that is rather short. It's called Chasing Ghost Microbursts. And in one of those episodes, I did discuss my thoughts on Venezuela, but I will confine those thoughts to that episode, and I'm going to contemplate maybe for a further episode where I'll revisit this very thing. So all of a sudden we see this pivot by the Europeans where they're saying, oh, Russia, 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 and now it's United States, United States, United States. It's a big threat, and that if a NATO member invades another NATO country, Article 5 is invoked and things go awry. As cynical as I am about American conventional military force, I would never call any war footing or active war or actual conduct of said war a walk in the park, but to fight against NATO itself, it almost seems like a thought experiment by an advocacy tank or a think tank in DC or in Europe, where they would say, well, what are we going to do about this and what would it look like? I just think that it would be an unmitigated disaster for NATO forces to contend against U.S. forces, because smart U.S. forces, if this were pressed and we had to fight against our NATO brethren, the very best way to do that, if we were to do so, is the paucity of forces that they would employ would just be not much to contend with in Greenland proper. The proper thing would be to decapitate C4I elements, port embarkation points on the continent and such. And of course, that would sunder and render NATO agreements moot, probably set in a decades-long enmity between Europe proper and the United States. And I don't condone that in any way. But I do think that there is a lot of provocation and naive provocation going on when it comes to the Europeans. And I think that the military checks that they can cash on what their ambitions are don't match the balance in their war banks. So I will close by saying that, is there an advantage to America purchasing Greenland? Sure there is. One could certainly make that case for practically anything like that when it comes to the Western Hemisphere, and one can call it the Arctic extension of the Monroe Doctrine. If we were to do so, could America do that? America could militarily defeat NATO forces on Greenland. There's no doubt in my mind that would happen. But if there were guerrilla or resistance forces that NATO sent there, much like what Churchill did during the war to save Joseph Stalin from 1939 to 1945, where he sent his Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare and the Special Operations Executive in conjunction with the Office of Strategic Services on the part of the U.S. to, in Churchill's words, quote, set Europe ablaze, end of quote. There's no doubt that that kind of asymmetric and Special Operations Forces mischief could cause all kinds of grief to forces that are occupying on there. The thing that I would be the most concerned about, though, would be the arming, training, and materiel provisioning of indigenous forces. That would be among those 55,000 Inuit and Greenlanders who are indigs in the country, and what they could do to an occupation force. There is no constructive end to militarily invading Greenland. I think that the Department of State, using the sofas that I talked about, starting with the 1951 agreement and others, can find ways to get basing opportunities and maybe even mineral extraction activities with a share of said activities being given to the indigs in a way that they would all agree to. That would be the way to do this. I find it on its face, military confrontation between Europe and America on Greenland, farcical and something that I would hope never happens. So there you go. A brief history of where Greenland has been, where it is now, what's going to happen in the future, and who knows what the next 12 months are going to look like. I did want to leave you with one anecdote, and that would be this. When I was stationed at the turn of the century in Germany, I had the opportunity to be a liaison escorting pifwiks out of Serbia and other reaches down there. During that unpleasantness, pifwiks are persons indicted for war crimes in the Balkan states. I was down there going after Radovan Karadzic and others. Well, they appointed me as a junior officer, no less, not only as a liaison to The Hague during this time, but also I got a message from my commander. He said, Bill, I need you to go to the Netherlands, and you, young Captain Bupert, are going to be the official United States liaison to Dutch Special Forces Command, Dutch SOCOM. I get a big head about this, and I think, wow, look at me, junior officer, soon to be a field grade, doing some interesting stuff down in Yugoslavia. Now I get this gig up here near The Hague where I'm shuttling back and forth between the Balkans and The Hague doing liaison work. And now another feather in my cap to be the United States liaison with Dutch SOCOM. Yeah. Well, it turns out that Dutch SOCOM were two guys in a modest apartment in a certain city in Holland. So my head was quite deflated after that. Nonetheless, I got to interact not only with the Dutch, but with Danes and others. And to their credit, the SOF organizations in Europe, Special Operations Forces organizations, are ones that I really came to appreciate. As a matter of fact, when I was in Afghanistan in 2015 on my last deployment tour, I got to work with Croatian Special Forces. As a matter of fact, as you've probably heard me mention if you listened to me before, we spent almost over 3 weeks in Croatia last year. Loved it. Great country. Very interesting. It was very interesting to go there and see what the place has become since the unpleasantness from 93 to 95, when we saw Yugoslavia shatter into several pieces, to include the NATO-sponsored Islamic rump state of Kosovo that was created to make heroin trafficking that much easier. So with that, I hope that by the time you hear this, and maybe the months forthcoming, if you don't happen to listen to this on the day of issue, that we are not at war with NATO, we have not militarily invaded Greenland, but I was hoping to give you some background and insight into just what's going on there. So a little bit of housekeeping. I wanted to thank all of my listeners. If you are a regular listener, please pass on to friends, family, colleagues, acquaintances, if you think they might find this interesting. If you become a paid subscriber, I have 52 of those now. I have nearly 3,000 subscribers on my Substack. Not only will you be privy to comms with me via my private email, but on occasion you will get my Chasing Ghosts microburst episodes that I send out only to my paid subscribers to hear my brain zephyrs of the day. Speaking of brain zephyrs, it just so happens I have that Substack, and on said Substack I have a notes page on which on a daily basis, 2, 3, 4, probably more times, depending on the cadence of my day job at the time, you'll find brain zephyrs and thoughts that come to mind, and then you can interact with me there. The thing that I love about my Substack is that I can interact with my listeners because there's a great comment function on there. and I will engage you in gentlemanly discourse and especially disagreement, because I really enjoy that. If you wish to get in touch with me via email, you can reach out to me at cgpodcast@pm.me. That is cgpodcast@pm.me. You will find this podcast on your favorite podcast provider. If you don't, let me know. And if you would be so kind as to leave 4 or 5 stars if you enjoy this. If you don't enjoy it, then you don't have to leave 1 or 2 stars. Just kidding. And if you were to leave a narrative review, I am forever grateful for your indulgence in doing that very thing. From my family to yours, Happy New Year. I hope this is a year of prosperity, maybe more children, maybe more grandchildren, a happy marriage, whatever the case may be. I'm having a terrific year. This past year has been a terrific year for my family. This year, we plan on moving the bunker complex from where we're at in Florida to another location in Florida. I think I'm one of 250 people in the state of Florida who was actually born here. I am a native-born Miami guy, although I wouldn't live in Miami today, but we do like to visit. Nonetheless, again, thanks for listening. Please pass the word. This is Bill, out.